Dead silence blanketed St. Patrick's old cathedral, broken only by cruel, muffled snickers echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Beatrice Gallagher stood frozen at the altar in an ivory gown deliberately tailored 2 sizes too small. Her soft, full figure spilled uncomfortably over the biting corsetry, a physical punchline to a dangerous, calculated joke. Her father, head of the Irish syndicate, had sent his overweight, invisible daughter to marry New York's most ruthless Mafia boss, fully expecting a bullet to sever their forced peace treaty. But as Lorenzo Costa finally stepped forward, his dark eyes didn't hold the anticipated disgust. Instead, they held a lethal promise of absolute ruin for every single person laughing at his bride. The air in the Gallagher estate in Brookville always smelled faintly of expensive cigars, old money, and unspoken cruelty. For 24 years, Beatrice had navigated the sprawling, mahogany-paneled halls like a ghost. She was the eldest daughter of William Gallagher, a man whose word was law on the docks of Brooklyn and the underground casinos of Queens. But in her father's eyes, Beatrice was a failure of genetics, while her younger sister, Sylvia, was a slender, sharp-featured socialite who looked like she belonged on the cover of Vogue. Beatrice was soft, plump, and quiet. She preferred the solitude of the estate's library to the glaring lights of the family's underground galas. Her weight had been a topic of household conversation since she was 10. To her father, she was an embarrassment. To her sister, she was a convenient stepping stone to elevate her own beauty. But the Gallagher family was currently hemorrhaging power. A botched weapons shipment near Red Hook had cost the Italian Costa family millions, and the resulting street war had pushed both syndicates to the brink of federal indictments. The old school commission, echoing the sit-downs of the Gambino and Lucchese eras, had mandated a peace treaty, a marriage, blood for blood, bound by a ring. Everyone in New York's underworld knew the bride was supposed to be Sylvia. Sylvia was the prize. Until the Tuesday before the wedding, Beatrice was in the solarium reading when her father's heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floor. William Gallagher, a man whose florid face betrayed decades of heavy drinking, dropped a garment bag on the rattan table. "Get up, Bea. The tailor is coming in an hour," William barked, lighting a Churchill cigar. Beatrice marked her page, looking up in confusion. "The tailor? Sylvia's fittings have been done for weeks." "Sylvia isn't marrying the Costa bastard," William said, blowing a plume of grey smoke towards the glass ceiling. "You are." The words hung in the humid air of the greenhouse. Beatrice's heart slammed against her ribs. Lorenzo Costa was a ghost story whispered among the Irish enforcers. He had taken over his family at 30 after his father's assassination outside Rouse in East Harlem. Lorenzo was known to be methodical, ice-cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Father, you can't be serious," Beatrice said, her voice trembling just slightly. "The commission agreed on Sylvia. If I send you, it sends a message," William interrupted, his eyes hardening into flint. "Costa thinks he can bleed me dry for one bad shipment? He thinks he can demand my best girl? No, I'm complying with the commission's ruling. I am giving him my eldest daughter. It's not my fault if she's a fat, unlovable sow." Beatrice flinched, the words striking with the precision of a practiced abuser. She looked down at her hands, the sting of humiliation burning the back of her eyes. She had long ago built a fortress around her heart to survive her family, but the sheer audacity of this plan terrified her. She wasn't just being insulted, she was being weaponized. "He will kill me," Beatrice whispered. "When he lifts the veil and sees it's me, he'll view it as an insult. He'll kill me right there at the altar." "Then we go to war," William said, callously, turning on his heel. and I'll have the backing of the commission because Costa broke the peace by killing a Gallagher. It's a win-win, B. For once in your life, you're actually useful." The next few days were a blur of calculated degradation. Sylvia's custom-made gown, tailored for a size 0 frame, was violently altered to fit Beatrice's size 16 body. The cruel seamstress, a woman loyal to Sylvia, let out the seams as much as she could, but the dress remained a medieval torture device. It dug into her waist, flattened her chest painfully, and made every breath a shallow, agonizing gasp. On the morning of the wedding, Sylvia leaned against the doorframe of Beatrice's bedroom, sipping a mimosa. "You look like a stuffed sausage, Bear." Sylvia laughed, her eyes glittering with malicious delight. "Try not to sweat through the silk before you reach the altar. I hear Lorenzo is quite the aesthete. I give it 10 seconds before he walks out, or shoots you." Beatrice stared at her reflection in the antique floor mirror. Her dark hair was pinned up intricately, her hazel eyes large and terrified beneath the heavy lace veil. The dress was a disaster. It clung to her stomach and hips in all the wrong ways, the fabric straining visibly at the zipper. She looked exactly as her father intended, like a joke, a massive, humiliating middle finger to the most dangerous man in New York. She didn't cry. Crying would give them what they wanted. Instead, Beatrice took a shallow breath against the biting corset, lifted her chin, and prepared to walk to her own execution. St. Patrick's Old Cathedral in Lower Manhattan was packed to the gills with the most lethal men and women on the eastern seaboard. The tension in the nave was thick enough to choke on. On the left sat the Irish, William Gallagher's lieutenants, captains, and political pawns, all wearing smug, knowing expressions. On the right sat the Italians, the Costa family, clad in immaculate dark tailoring, their faces stony and expecting the arrival of the beautiful Sylvia Gallagher. The heavy oak doors groaned open. The organist struck the first heavy chords of the bridal chorus. Beatrice stepped into the threshold, her hand resting lightly on her father's rigid arm. The reaction was instantaneous. The collective intake of breath from the right side of the aisle was audible over the music. It was followed immediately by a low, dangerous murmur that swept through the pews like a lit fuse. "Who is that?" "That's not Sylvia. Look at her. The dress is splitting. It's an insult. Gallagher is mocking us." Beatrice kept her eyes locked dead ahead. Her face burned with the heat of 1,000 humiliating stares. Every step was agony, both physically from the suffocating dress and mentally from the sheer weight of the room's hostility. She could feel the men on the Costa side shifting in their seats, hands discreetly moving toward the inside breasts of their jackets. At the end of the long, velvet-carpeted aisle stood Lorenzo Costa. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and imposing in a charcoal Brioni suit that fit him with lethal perfection. His face was a mask of aristocratic angles, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes as dark and unfathomable as an ocean trench. Beside him, his underboss, a scarred man named Glens the Razor Santoro, leaned in. "Boss," Glens hissed, his voice carrying in the cavernous quiet. "It's a trick. He sent the fat one. Say the word and we paint these walls red." Beatrice's breath hitched. She stopped walking, freezing just 10 feet from the altar. Her father yanked her arm roughly, trying to pull her forward, but her feet were glued to the floor. She looked at Lorenzo, bracing herself for the disgust, for the outrage, for the signal that would turn the cathedral into a slaughterhouse. Lorenzo's dark eyes swept over her. He took in the straining fabric of the dress, the flush of shame on her cheeks, the trembling of her hands, and the cruel, triumphant smirk on William Gallagher's face. Lorenzo didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. Instead, he stepped down from the altar, closing the distance between them. The cathedral fell into a terrifying, breathless silence. William Gallagher let go of Beatrice's arm, stepping back instinctively as Lorenzo approached. "William," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that echoed with absolute authority. "You seem to have forgotten how to treat a bride on her wedding day. You're gripping her like a hostage." William puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his bravado. "She's all yours, Costa, per the commission's agreement. A Gallagher daughter for a Costa son." Lorenzo ignored the older man completely. He stopped right in front of Beatrice. Up close, he smelled of cedarwood, expensive bergamot, and a faint, metallic hint of danger. He raised a large, calloused hand and gently lifted the heavy lace veil from her face. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the pity or revulsion she was certain to find in his gaze. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She opened her hazel eyes. Lorenzo was staring intently at her face, completely ignoring her body, ignoring the disastrous dress. "What is your name?" he asked. "Beatrice," she whispered, her voice cracking. Lorenzo turned his head slightly toward his underboss. "Glenn's. Sit down. We are having a wedding." A shocked gasp rippled through the Gallagher side. William's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, panicked confusion. This wasn't the script. Lorenzo was supposed to reject her. "Costa, wait a minute," William started, stepping forward. Lorenzo snapped his gaze to William, and the sheer violence in his eyes made the older man freeze. "You delivered my bride, Gallagher. Your role in this ceremony is over. Sit in your pew, or I will have Glenn's nail your feet to it." The Irish boss turned pale, swallowing hard before retreating to the front row. Lorenzo turned back to Beatrice. He offered her his arm. "Walk with me, Beatrice." She tentatively looped her arm through his. He felt like solid granite beneath his tailored suit. As they took the final steps to the altar, Lorenzo leaned his head down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, so only she could hear him. "I know exactly what he is trying to do," Lorenzo murmured, his voice a velvet threat. "And I know exactly how much this dress is hurting you. Breathe shallow. We will be out of here in 10 minutes, and I promise you, no one in this room will ever laugh at you again." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. A tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of shame. For the first time in her 24 years of life, someone had stood between her and the cruelty of the world. The priest, a small, sweating man, stammered through the Latin rites. When it came time for the rings, Lorenzo's hands were surprisingly gentle as he slid a heavy, flawless emerald-cut diamond onto her trembling, chubby finger. It fit perfectly. "I, Lorenzo. Take you, Beatrice," he said, his voice ringing loud and clear across the silent church, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lorenzo didn't do the customary polite peck on the cheek. He took her face in both his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her stray tear, and kissed her firmly on the lips. It was a kiss of possession, a public claiming that sent a shockwave of electricity straight down Beatrice's spine. As they turned to face the congregation, Lorenzo's grip on her waist was ironclad. He stared down the aisle, his eyes locking onto the Gallagher family. "Anyone who disrespects my wife," Lorenzo announced to the silent room, "disrespects me, and you all know what happens then." The reception was a master class in suffocating tension. Held at a lavish, heavily guarded banquet hall in Midtown, the two families mingled like oil and water. Beatrice sat at the sweetheart table beside Lorenzo, feeling like she was floating outside of her own body. Her father and sister had kept their distance. Sylvia had glared daggers at Beatrice from across the room, clearly infuriated that her sister had not been humiliated and discarded as planned. Beatrice had spent the last 2 hours barely touching her food, hyper-aware of the massive man sitting beside her. Lorenzo had been polite, terrifyingly so. He intercepted anyone who approached their table, effortlessly dominating the conversations and shielding Beatrice from the thinly veiled sneers of the Gallagher associates. By 11 p.m., Lorenzo stood up and buttoned his jacket. "We're leaving," he said simply. He didn't ask for her father's blessing to depart. He didn't say goodbye. He merely placed a hand on the small of Beatrice's back and guided her out of the hall, flanked by Glenn's and 3 other heavily armed men. The ride to Staten Island was silent. The partition in the armored Maybach was rolled up, leaving Beatrice and Lorenzo in the plush, dimly lit back seat. Beatrice stared out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. The adrenaline of the ceremony was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying reality. She was now married to a Mafia boss. The protection at the altar was likely just a public show of dominance, a way to thwart her father's plan. Now, behind closed doors, she expected the real punishment to begin. The car passed through towering wrought-iron gates, winding up a long, tree-lined driveway in Tot Hill, the most exclusive and heavily fortified neighborhood on Staten Island. The Costa estate was a sprawling, modern fortress of stone and glass, overlooking the distant, glittering skyline of Manhattan. The moment they stepped through the front doors, a stern-faced, older Italian woman in a black dress was waiting for them. "Welcome home, Don Lorenzo," the woman said, bowing her head slightly. She turned to Beatrice, her eyes scanning her with intense curiosity, but absolutely no malice. "And welcome, Signora Costa. I am Mrs. Rossi, the housekeeper." "Mrs. Rossi," Lorenzo said, shrugging off his suit jacket. "Have Antoinette brought to the master suite immediately." Beatrice's blood ran cold. Antoinette? Who was Antoinette? Was he bringing another woman to their room? Was this the humiliation he had saved for private? Lorenzo noticed her sudden rigidity. He looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Antoinette is my family's personal tailor. I called her during the reception." He gestured to the grand staircase, and Beatrice followed him up, her heavy dress dragging awkwardly on the carpet. They entered the master suite, a massive, minimalist room with floor-to-ceiling windows, dark wood, and a king-sized bed that made Beatrice swallow hard. A petite woman with measuring tape draped around her neck was already waiting in the adjoining sitting area. "Antoinette," Lorenzo said, "get my wife out of this abomination of a dress. It's cutting off her circulation. And take her measurements. I want an entirely new wardrobe commissioned by tomorrow morning. Throw away anything with the Gallagher name on it." Antoinette nodded quickly. "Right away, Don Lorenzo." Lorenzo turned to Beatrice. "I'm going to my study to pour a drink. Let Antoinette help you. When you are comfortable, come find me down the hall." He left the room, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft click. Beatrice stood frozen for a moment before Antoinette gently touched her arm. "Signora, let's get you out of this trap, yes?" It took 10 minutes to unhook and unzip the violently altered Vera Wang gown. When the dress finally pooled at Beatrice's feet, she took her first, full, deep breath in 12 hours. The relief was so profound, she almost wept. Antoinette gently guided her into a plush, silk robe that was deliciously oversized and incredibly soft. "He is a good man, the Don," Antoinette murmured, as she quickly and efficiently took Beatrice's measurements. "Tough, but he protects what is his." What is his? The words echoed in Beatrice's mind as Antoinette packed up her things and left. Beatrice tied the sash of the robe around her waist, catching a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror. She looked pale, her makeup smudged, her hair half falling out of its intricate pins. She was fat, yes. She had a soft belly, thick thighs, and wide hips. She had spent her entire life apologizing for taking up space, but tonight Lorenzo Costa had looked at her and demanded she take up more space. Steeling her nerves, Beatrice walked out of the bedroom and padded silently down the carpeted hallway. A sliver of warm, amber light spilled from beneath a door at the end of the hall. She pushed it open slowly. Lorenzo was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had taken off his tie, and the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes tracking her movements as she stepped into the room. "Better?" he asked, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite his desk. "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice surprisingly steady. She sat down, pulling the silk robe tighter around herself. "Thank you." Lorenzo took a slow sip of his drink. "Your father is a fool, Beatrice. A predictable, arrogant fool." Beatrice looked down at her lap. He thought if he sent me, you would be so insulted by my appearance that you would kill me, or at least break the treaty. He wanted an excuse to go to war with the backing of the commission. "I know exactly what he wanted," Lorenzo said, setting his glass down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, clasping his hands together. He thought I was as vain and shallow as he is. He thought I wanted a vapid, sharp-tongued trophy like your sister to sit on my arm. Beatrice looked up, surprised by the venom in his voice when he mentioned Sylvia. "You know Sylvia?" "I know of her, and I know of you," Lorenzo said, his gaze locking onto hers. It was a piercing look, stripping away all her defenses. "Did you think I run the most powerful family in this city without doing my research?" Beatrice blinked. "Research? On me?" 6 months ago, at the mayor's charity gala at the Plaza Hotel, Lorenzo said quietly. "Your father was busy drinking himself into a stupor at the bar. Your sister was flirting with the federal prosecutor, and you were sitting in the corner, successfully negotiating a quiet side deal with the union boss for the docks, a deal your father later took credit for." Beatrice's jaw dropped. She had no idea anyone had been watching her that night. She had merely been doing what she always did, cleaning up her family's messes from the shadows because her father was too incompetent to do it himself. "You're the brains of the Gallagher operation, Beatrice," Lorenzo stated, stating a fact rather than a compliment. "Your father is too blinded by his own prejudice to see it. He looks at you and sees a weight problem. I look at you and see the only person in the Gallagher family who actually understands how to run an empire." Beatrice's chest tightened. She didn't know how to process this. For years she had been told she was worthless. Now, the most dangerous man in the city was looking at her as if she were a queen. "So," Beatrice started, trying to find her footing, "you didn't just accept me to spite my father?" Lorenzo stood up from his desk and walked around it, leaning against the edge right in front of her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Spiting your father was a pleasant bonus," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. "But no, when the commission demanded a marriage, I made sure the phrasing of the contract demanded William Gallagher's eldest daughter. Your father, in his infinite stupidity, thought I meant Sylvia, because he doesn't even consider you a person. He thought he was pulling a fast one on me today by swapping you in." Lorenzo reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a loose strand of dark hair behind Beatrice's ear. The touch was so gentle, so reverent, it made her breath hitch. "He didn't trick me, mea cara," Lorenzo whispered fiercely. "I orchestrated it. I wanted you." Beatrice stared up at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "Why?" "Because a king needs a queen who can actually rule," Lorenzo said, his thumb grazing her jawline. "Not a porcelain doll who breaks at the first sign of pressure. Your family has treated you like dirt, Beatrice. They sent you here to die. But they made a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" she breathed. Lorenzo's eyes darkened with a terrifying, thrilling promise of violence and devotion. "They gave you to me. And now, together, we are going to dismantle the Gallagher family brick by brick, and we are going to make them beg for your forgiveness before we burn them to the ground." The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the master suite, casting long, golden shadows across the Egyptian cotton sheets. For the first time in her life, Beatrice woke up feeling safe. She shifted under the heavy duvet, her hand brushing against the empty, still warm space beside her. Lorenzo was already up. When she walked into the adjoining dressing room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The barren racks from the night before were now filled. Antoinette had worked a miracle overnight. Row upon row of bespoke clothing hung neatly, cashmere sweaters in deep emeralds and rich burgundies, tailored slacks cut to accommodate her hips, silk blouses, and structured blazers that didn't pinch or squeeze. On a velvet ottoman sat 3 pairs of custom Christian Louboutin heels and several boxes of imported Italian lingerie. There was a small, heavy card resting on a vanity tray. The handwriting was sharp and aggressively elegant. "For my wife. Wear the emerald green. Come down to the study when you are ready." L. Beatrice traced the sharp ink of the L. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the clothes. It was the fact that he had paid attention. He wasn't trying to hide her in shapeless muumuus, nor was he forcing her into corsets meant to torture her into an acceptable mold. He was outfitting her for a war. 40 minutes later, Beatrice walked down the sweeping marble staircase. The emerald green silk blouse draped beautifully over her full breasts, tapering to tuck into a pair of high-waisted, wide-leg black trousers that made her feel taller, more grounded. She looked like a woman who belonged in this fortress. When she approached the study, the heavy oak doors were cracked open. She could hear the low, tense rumble of men's voices. "Boss, it's a set-up," a raspy voice argued. "Gallagher is bleeding the Brooklyn Navy Yard dry. We're short $2 million on the import tariffs this quarter. He's skimming, and he's using the wedding as a distraction." "Let him skim for another week, Carmine," Lorenzo's smooth baritone replied. "I want to know exactly which shell accounts the money is landing in before we freeze them." "With all due respect, Don Lorenzo," another voice, Glenn's the underboss from the altar, chimed in. "The Irish have a dozen shell companies. It'll take forensic accountants months to trace the ghost accounts. By then, Gallagher will have bought off half the Port Authority." Beatrice pushed the door open. The hinges were silent, but the sudden draft drew the attention of the 4 men in the room. Carmine, a burly capo with a broken nose, stopped mid-sentence. Glenn's hand twitched toward his waistband out of sheer habit. They stared at her, assessing the daughter of their enemy, clearly unsure if she was a hostage, a spy, or a liability. Lorenzo sat behind his desk, flanked by his men. The moment he saw her, the cold, calculating mask he wore for his capos melted away, replaced by a look of possessive, burning approval. His dark eyes roamed over the emerald silk, tracing the curve of her hips and the soft line of her jaw. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping a dangerous octave, "you will stand when my wife enters the room." Chairs scraped frantically against the hardwood. Carmine, Glenn's, and a thin, bespectacled accountant named Paulie scrambled to their feet, dipping their heads in a hasty show of respect. "Sit," Beatrice said, her voice surprisingly steady. She walked over to the large mahogany conference table where blueprints and ledgers were strewn about. She didn't shrink under their stares. She leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the rows of numbers Paulie had been agonizing over. "You're looking in the wrong place," Beatrice said quietly. Paulie blinked, exchanging a bewildered look with Carmine. "Excuse me, Signora?" Beatrice tapped a perfectly manicured, plump finger on a line item labelled Harbour Maintenance Company. "My father isn't using the old shell accounts. He knows you have eyes on Celtic hauling and Shamrock logistics. 6 months ago, my sister Sylvia started dating a junior executive at a maritime sanitation firm based out of Hoboken." She looked up, meeting Lorenzo's gaze. He was watching her with the rapt attention of a predator who had just realized his mate was equally lethal. "The firm is called Apex Waterways," Beatrice continued, turning back to the capos. "My father routes the skimmed tariff money through their payroll as phantom contractor fees. Then it gets funneled into a trust fund under my late mother's maiden name in the Caymans. Account number ends in 4409. I have the routing numbers memorized." Silence fell over the study, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a bomb detonation. Glenn's jaw slackened. Carmine stared at Beatrice as if she had just grown a second head. Paulie scrambled to pull out his encrypted tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. "Holy Mother of God," Paulie whispered, staring at his screen. "She's right. Boss, it's all here. Millions. It's been moving right under our noses." Carmine looked at Beatrice, the skepticism entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, terrifying respect. "Signora Costa, how do you know this?" "Because my father can barely use a smartphone, let alone launder money," Beatrice said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I spent the last 5 years balancing his books to keep the feds off our doorstep. He thought I was just doing administrative busywork because I was too ugly to be put to use anywhere else." Lorenzo stood up. He walked slowly around the desk, his presence commanding the absolute attention of every man in the room. He stopped beside Beatrice, wrapping a heavy protective arm around her waist, pulling her soft curves flush against his hard side. "I told you all," Lorenzo murmured, his eyes locking onto Glenn's. "We didn't just gain a truce yesterday. We gained the keys to William Gallagher's kingdom." He pressed a kiss to her temple, ignoring the presence of his highest-ranking men. "Glenn's. Call our contacts at the SEC, anonymously leak the Apex Waterways routing numbers. Let the federal government freeze Gallagher's hidden assets. I want him broke and panicking by Friday." "Yes, boss," Glenn's said, bowing his head to Lorenzo, and then, distinctly, bowing his head to Beatrice. "Yes, Signora." As the men filed out of the room to execute the orders, Beatrice felt her knees tremble. The adrenaline was fading. She had just betrayed her blood. She had just signed her father's financial death warrant. Lorenzo felt her tremble. He turned her around, backing her gently against the edge of the desk. He gripped her waist, his thumbs tracing the soft flare of her hips. "Regrets, mia cara?" he asked softly. Beatrice looked up into his dark, fathomless eyes. "No. He sold me to the wolves. He just didn't realize the wolf would teach me how to bite." A slow, wicked smile spread across Lorenzo's aristocratic face. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a tantalizing, agonizing tease. "You are magnificent," he breathed against her mouth. "Every single inch of you." When he kissed her, it wasn't a public show of possession like at the altar. It was a private, consuming devotion. He didn't avoid her softness. He worshipped it. His hands tangled in her dark hair, pulling her closer until the memory of every insult she had ever endured burned away in the heat of his touch. By Friday, the New York underworld was in chaos. The federal raid on Apex Waterways made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The feds froze nearly $60 million in illegal assets. William Gallagher's empire was suddenly starved of oxygen. Rumors swirled from the Bronx to the Battery that the Irish were missing payrolls for their enforcers. The Costa family, meanwhile, remained utterly silent. Lorenzo played the part of the newlywed, untouchable and unbothered, while his men quietly absorbed the territories Gallagher was losing his grip on. That evening, Lorenzo informed Beatrice they were going out. "We need to be seen," Lorenzo explained, as they rode in the back of the Maybach toward Manhattan. "The 5 families need to see that my house is in order, and that my wife is the undisputed queen of the Costa Syndicate." They arrived at Le Bernardin, Midtown's temple of French seafood, where getting a table required either 6 months' notice or the kind of power that made chefs nervous. Lorenzo didn't have a reservation. The maitre d' simply paled, cleared out a prime corner booth, and bowed them inside. Beatrice wore a stunning, off-the-shoulder black velvet gown that Antoinette had created. It hugged her generous curves perfectly, and around her neck rested a string of flawless Costa family diamonds that Lorenzo had fastened himself. She felt beautiful. She felt dangerous. They were halfway through their lobster carpaccio when the atmosphere in the restaurant abruptly shifted. Beatrice noticed Lorenzo's jaw clench, his eyes fixed on the entrance. She followed his gaze. William and Sylvia Gallagher had just walked in. William looked haggard, the florid flush of his face replaced by a sickly, desperate pallor. Beside him, Sylvia looked like a venomous snake poured into a backless, skin-tight scarlet dress. She was scanning the room with predatory eyes. When she spotted Lorenzo, a triumphant, malicious smirk crossed her face. She didn't even look at Beatrice. "Lorenzo," Beatrice whispered, her heart accelerating. "Keep eating, mia cara," Lorenzo said, his voice cold and flat, picking up his wine glass. "Do not give them the satisfaction of a reaction." But Sylvia was already charting a path straight for their table, leaving her father hovering near the coat check. She moved with the confident swagger of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. She arrived at the booth, ignoring Beatrice entirely, and leaned heavily against the table, giving Lorenzo a generous view down the front of her dress. "Don Costa," Sylvia purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What a surprise to see you here. I was hoping I'd run into you. We have some family business to discuss." Lorenzo didn't look at her chest. He didn't even look at her face. He carefully cut a piece of lobster, placed it in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed, taking an agonizingly long time before finally lifting his gaze to the woman invading his space. "I don't recall inviting you to my table," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying the chilling indifference of a winter wind. Sylvia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she rallied, letting out a tinkling laugh. "Oh, Lorenzo, there's no need to be so hostile. I know my father pulled a fast one on you. The commission contract, the mix-up at the altar." She finally spared a glance at Beatrice, her eyes raking over her sister's body with practiced disgust. "I know you're stuck with the family joke, but I wanted to let you know, just because she has your ring doesn't mean you can't have the real prize on the side. We can fix my father's mistake." Beatrice gripped her napkin under the table, her knuckles turning white. The sheer, brazen audacity of her sister made her nauseous. Sylvia was offering herself as a mistress to save their father's collapsing empire, while simultaneously trying to strip Beatrice of the only dignity she had ever known. Lorenzo set his fork down. The soft clink of silver against porcelain sounded like a gunshot. He looked at Sylvia, his dark eyes void of any human warmth. "The real prize?" Lorenzo echoed softly. "I can be very discreet." Sylvia leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And you wouldn't have to be seen in public with that." Lorenzo didn't raise his voice, but the sheer, raw menace bleeding from him made the two tables adjacent to them suddenly go silent. "Let me clarify something for you, Sylvia," Lorenzo said, his tone deadly calm. "I drafted the contract. I specified the eldest daughter. If your father had sent you down that aisle, I would have put a bullet between your eyes in front of the priest and declared war right then and there." Sylvia physically recoiled, her face draining of color. "What? What are you talking about?" "You are a vacuous, incompetent parasite," Lorenzo continued, methodically dissecting her ego with surgical precision. "You possess nothing of value. No intellect, no loyalty, and no use to a man who runs an empire. My wife has more worth in her little finger than your entire bloodline." Lorenzo reached across the table, taking Beatrice's trembling hand in his, raising her knuckles to his lips for a brief, reverent kiss. "Now." Lorenzo's eyes locked back onto Sylvia, narrowing into slits of pure malice. "You have exactly 5 seconds to walk away from my wife's table before I have Glenn's drag you out of this restaurant by your hair and toss you into the East River." Sylvia stood frozen, utterly humiliated, her mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. She looked back at her father, who was watching in horror, realizing their last desperate gamble had just failed spectacularly. But before Sylvia could retreat, Beatrice found her voice. The years of swallowing her sister's cruelty vanished, replaced by the steel she had forged in Lorenzo's fire. "Sylvia," Beatrice said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the quiet dining room. Sylvia looked down at her eyes brimming with humiliated tears and raw hatred. "Tell Richard Sterling at the Guggenheim board that his offshore accounts aren't as secure as he thinks," Beatrice said calmly, referencing the wealthy, married art dealer Sylvia had been secretly blackmailing for the past year to fund her lavish lifestyle. Sylvia gasped, stumbling backward as if physically struck. "How do you know about Richard?" "I know everything," Beatrice replied, leaning back in the plush leather booth, looking every bit the mob boss's wife. "And if you or our father ever approach me or my husband again, I will mail the evidence to his wife, the SEC, and the New York Post. You'll be wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of designer silk. Do you understand me?" Sylvia gave a frantic, jerky nod. She spun on her stiletto heel and practically ran out of the restaurant, grabbing William's arm and dragging the defeated Irish boss out into the cold Manhattan night. The heavy tension in the restaurant slowly dissipated as the ambient chatter tentatively resumed. Beatrice let out a shaky breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Lorenzo. He was staring at her, an expression of profound, primal awe on his face. "Remind me," Lorenzo murmured, a dark, devastating smile playing on his lips. "Never to make you angry, Signora Costa." Beatrice finally smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her hazel eyes. She squeezed his hand, the heavy emerald diamond catching the candlelight. "I think you're safe, Don Costa," she whispered. "For now." In the weeks after Les Bernardins, the Gallagher empire suffocated under Beatrice's precision. Federal agents flooded Brooklyn's docks, cutting off cash flow and loyalty in one swift blow. Now seated in Lorenzo's sunlit study, Beatrice calmly orchestrated the takeover, reviewing ledgers with sharp focus. When reports showed vendors withholding profits, she chose strategy over force, offering incentives instead of threats. Control, she knew, was built on stability, not fear. As Carmine carried out her orders, Lorenzo returned, his presence easing, but not disrupting the quiet dominance she now held. He walked around the desk, pulling her chair out and lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Beatrice let out a soft gasp as he settled into her chair, pulling her onto his lap. She curled against his broad chest, her soft curves fitting perfectly against the hard planes of his body. "How is my beautiful wife destroying her enemies today?" Lorenzo murmured, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her Tom Ford perfume. "Systematically," Beatrice whispered, threading her fingers through his dark hair. "My father missed payroll for the 3rd week in a row. His lieutenants are defecting. I give it 48 hours before he does something desperate." Lorenzo's hand slid up her thigh, his thumb drawing lazy circles on her skin. "I have men watching his estate in Brookville. If he sneezes, I know about it. He has no moves left, Mia Cara. You checkmated him the moment you exposed Apex Waterways. But a cornered rat is often the most dangerous." Later that evening, Lorenzo had to attend an emergency meeting in Manhattan regarding a sudden strike at the shipyard. He took Glenn's and 4 guards, leaving Beatrice at the Staten Island estate with Mrs. Rossi and a skeleton crew of 6 highly trained enforcers. The storm rolled in around 10 p.m., bringing driving rain that lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite. Beatrice was in the attached reading room, curled up on a velvet chaise lounge with a first edition of Wuthering Heights, a gift from Lorenzo. The first sign that something was wrong was the sudden, absolute darkness. The power grid for the entire Tot Hill estate flickered and died. The backup generators, which should have kicked on within 3 seconds, remained dead. Beatrice's heart slammed against her ribs. She set her book down slowly. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the aggressive drumming of the rain. She slipped her feet into her slippers and crept to the door. "Mrs. Rossi?" Beatrice called out softly into the pitch-black hallway. There was no answer. Then she heard it. The muffled thwip of a silenced gunshot from the ground floor, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the marble foyer. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked in her veins. Her father hadn't tried to attack Lorenzo in the city. He had used the shipyard strike as a decoy to draw Lorenzo away, so he could strike at the estate. He had come for her. Beatrice didn't freeze. The years of hyper-vigilance, of surviving the psychological warfare of the Gallagher household, took over. She rushed back into the master suite and locked the heavy oak door, throwing the deadbolt. She ran to the bedside table, pulling open the bottom drawer. Lorenzo had placed a sleek, black Glock 19 there on their second night. "I will always protect you," he had told her, "but a queen must know how to hold a blade in the dark." He had taken her to the underground range beneath the estate to teach her how to shoot. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cold metal, checking the safety just as he had shown her. Heavy footsteps pounded up the grand staircase. "Check the guest rooms! Find the fat bitch!" A gruff, familiar voice barked. It was Mickey Sullivan, her father's most ruthless enforcer. "William wants her alive, but he didn't say she had to be in one piece." Beatrice backed away from the bedroom door, her breathing shallow. The master suite was a fortress, but the doors wouldn't hold forever against a determined crew with breaching tools. She remembered the blueprints of the house she had studied. Lorenzo's estate had a panic room, but it was in the basement. She was trapped on the 2nd floor. "Think," Beatrice commanded herself. "You are smarter than them." The estate's security system was hardwired, but Lorenzo had installed a localized, battery-operated smart hub in the master closet that controlled the reinforced steel shutters on the windows and the electronic locks on the suite's secondary doors. She ran into the expansive walk-in closet, navigating the darkness by memory. She found the touch panel glowing faintly on emergency battery power. Her fingers flew across the screen. She initiated the lockdown protocol for the second floor, slamming heavy steel fire doors shut across the main hallway, essentially dividing the upstairs in half and blocking the primary route to the master suite. Outside the bedroom, she heard Sullivan curse violently as the steel doors slammed shut down the hall, trapping 2 of his men on the other side. "The door is locked!" someone yelled from right outside her bedroom. "Blow the hinges!" Beatrice backed into the darkest corner of the bedroom, raising the Glock, aiming it squarely at chest height toward the door. Boom! The heavy oak door splintered inward with a deafening crash, the concussive force rattling the windows. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. "Spread out!" Sullivan ordered, stepping into the room, a submachine gun sweeping the area. "Check the bathroom, check the closets." Beatrice held her breath, pressing herself against the silk-lined wall. One of the men stepped into her line of sight, his flashlight sweeping inches from her face. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man screamed, clutching his shoulder as he went down hard. "She's got a gun by the window!" Sullivan roared, turning his weapon. Before he could fire, a horrifying sound echoed from the front driveway. It was the screaming, tortured roar of a V12 engine pushed past its limits, followed by the screech of tires and the crash of the front gates being violently rammed open. Lorenzo had returned. The distraction was all Beatrice needed. She fired twice more in the dark, forcing Sullivan and the remaining men to dive for cover behind the heavy mahogany bed. Downstairs, all hell broke loose. The distinct, terrifying sound of automatic weapons fire erupted in the foyer. Lorenzo had not brought a peace delegation. He had brought a fully armed hit squad. The screams of the Irish enforcers echoed up the staircase, brutal and short-lived. Sullivan panicked. "Screw the boss's orders. Kill her and let's find a window," he shouted to his remaining man. He popped up from behind the bed, raising his gun toward Beatrice's corner. Before he could pull the trigger, the shattered remains of the bedroom door were kicked completely out of the frame. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, an absolute vision of vengeance. He was soaked in rain, his Brioni suit ruined, holding an assault rifle. His eyes were wild, scanning the room in the dark until they locked onto the muzzle flash of Sullivan's gun. Lorenzo didn't just shoot Sullivan. He emptied half a magazine into the enforcer, the sheer force throwing the man backward through the glass of the vanity mirror. The remaining Irish thug dropped his weapon instantly, falling to his knees and raising his hands in the dark. "Don't shoot! I surrender! I surrender!" The man sobbed. Lorenzo stepped into the room, ignoring the man completely. "Beatrice!" he roared, his voice cracking with a terror she had never heard from him before. "I'm here!" she gasped, stepping out of the shadows, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the Glock onto the carpet. Lorenzo dropped his rifle. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, dropping to his knees and pulling her down into his arms. He crushed her against his chest, his hands frantically roaming over her soft body, checking for blood, for wounds, for any sign that they had hurt her. "Are you hit? Did they touch you?" he demanded, his breathing ragged, his face buried in her hair. "I'm okay. I'm okay," Beatrice sobbed, finally letting the adrenaline crash. She buried her face in his wet neck, clinging to his broad shoulders. "I shot one of them. The other one is surrendering." Lorenzo held her tight, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, murmuring desperate Italian prayers of gratitude into her skin. He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You are so brave, Maya Regina," he whispered fiercely. "So beautiful. So perfect." He stood up, pulling her to her feet and keeping her tucked firmly behind him. He turned his attention to the surviving Irish enforcer, kneeling on the floor. Glens and Carmine rushed into the room, their weapons drawn, sweeping the area. "House is clear, boss," Glenn said, breathing heavily. 4 dead downstairs. We lost 2 guards. Lorenzo looked down at the trembling man. Who gave the order to target my wife? William, the man cried out. Gallagher. He said if he couldn't have his money, he wanted his daughter back to use as a hostage against you. He's at the warehouse in Red Hook, waiting for us to bring her. Lorenzo's expression went completely blank. It was a terrifying, dead calm that promised absolute destruction. He turned to Glenn's. Take my wife to the penthouse at the Carlyle in Manhattan. Surround the floor with 20 men. No one gets in or out, Lorenzo ordered softly. He then looked at Carmine. Gather every capo, every soldier, every piece of artillery we have. We are going to Red Hook, and we are going to burn William Gallagher's empire to the ground with him inside it. Beatrice grabbed Lorenzo's arm. Lorenzo, wait. He looked back at her, the violence in his eyes softening instantly. He tried to take you from me, Beatrice. He dies tonight. I know, Beatrice said, her voice steadying. She stood tall, refusing to shrink. But a king doesn't clean up the garbage, and neither does a queen. You don't just kill him in the dark. You make an example of him in the light. Lorenzo paused, listening. If you shoot him in a warehouse, he becomes a martyr to the old Irish Guard, Beatrice explained, her brilliant mind working rapidly. We have the surviving enforcer. Have him call my father. Tell him the extraction was a success, but the estate was too hot, so they are bringing me to the docks at Pier 84. When he shows up expecting a hostage, he finds the commission. A slow, dark smile spread across Lorenzo's face. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. You want to strip him of his crown in front of the 5 families before taking his head. I want him to know, Beatrice said coldly, that the daughter he called a fat, useless joke was the one who pulled the trigger on his execution. Midnight fog rolled thick over Pier 84, swallowing the Hudson in a damp, ghostly haze. William Gallagher paced beside a rusted shipping container, his nerves fraying with every passing second. Sylvia stood close behind him, trembling in a silk nightgown hidden beneath a thin trench coat. He had brought her as insurance, paranoia disguised as protection. Headlights sliced through the fog. A black SUV came to a slow stop. William exhaled sharply, gripping his revolver. When they bring her out, he muttered, we take her back, 50 million by morning, or they get her in pieces. The doors opened, but it wasn't his men. 4 armed enforcers stepped out, rifles raised. Before William could react, floodlights erupted, turning night into blinding day. He staggered, shielding his eyes. Then he saw them, a semicircle of power, leaders of the 5 families, seated like silent judges. And at the center stood Lorenzo Costa. Beside him, Beatrice, unharmed, composed, radiating a quiet, lethal authority. William's gun slipped from his hand. What is this? He croaked. You broke the treaty, Lorenzo said, his voice carrying across the pier. You attacked my home. You tried to harm my wife. Murmurs rippled through the gathered bosses. William pointed wildly. He stole from me. I did, Beatrice cut in calmly. Silence fell. She stepped forward, Lorenzo's hand steady at her back. I exposed your operations, redirected your assets. You didn't lose your empire, father. I dismantled it. Shock twisted his face into something unrecognizable. Lorenzo moved first. A single gunshot cracked through the fog. William collapsed, screaming, clutching his shattered knee. No one intervened. You will show respect, Lorenzo said coldly. Then he turned to the others. His territory is forfeit. His life is forfeit. Any objections? None came. He handed the gun to Beatrice. It's your choice. She looked down at her father, broken, pleading, reduced to nothing. Then she shook her head. "Death is too kind," she said quietly. "He'll live long enough to be forgotten." As sirens wailed in the distance, Beatrice turned away, taking Lorenzo's arm. "Take me home." Beatrice Gallagher was sent to the altar as a pawn, a cruel punchline wrapped in ill-fitting silk, meant to trigger a war. But the men who orchestrated her humiliation severely underestimated the power of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving in the shadows. Lorenzo Costa didn't see a flaw to be mocked. He recognized a brilliant strategic mind and worshipped the soft, generous curves her family had so viciously despised. Together, they didn't just survive the treacherous underbelly of New York's Mafia, they conquered it. Beatrice dismantled her tyrannical father's empire with surgical precision, merging it with the Costa Syndicate to become the undisputed queen of the 5 boroughs. She no longer hid in the background, apologizing for taking up space. Beside her devoted, ruthless husband, Beatrice claimed every inch of her power, proving that the most dangerous weapon in the room is the one everyone underestimates: